Hello, I'm Peter. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. With Christmas just around the corner, I hope you are finding moments of peace amidst the bustling season. Whatever this time of year brings you, I wish you warmth, safety, and a heart at rest. Before you settle in, I wonder if I might ask you something. What kept you awake today? Was it the weight of unfinished tasks, the hum of worry that never quite stops, or perhaps just the bright noise of a world that refuses to slow down? Whatever it is, you can set it aside now. Not forever, just for tonight. Because where we're going, none of that exists. Where we're going, time itself nearly stopped. Tonight, we're traveling back to a winter that refused to end. To a place where 17 men from Amsterdam, sailors who knew the feel of warm harbour taverns and summer trade winds, found themselves trapped in a darkness so complete that the sun vanished for 4 months. A cold so deep that metal could shatter like glass wine froze solid in its cask, and the very air seemed to crystallize in your lungs before you could breathe it out. This isn't the movie version of survival. The truth of 1596 was colder, quieter, and infinitely more terrifying. Huddled in a shipwreck shack, 17 men realized that staying alive isn't a dramatic gesture, but a delicate balance struck in the dark, between the toxic fumes of a fire and the numbing freeze waiting outside. Tonight, we feel what they felt, the desperate intimacy of relying on a neighbor's breath just to make it through a winter that wanted them gone. We remember Barentsz, the lost navigator, and De Vere, the chronicler, who preserved their struggle. But the true soul of this story lies with the men who survived them. They learned that in the absolute dark, you don't survive on food alone, but on the small defiant acts of living. It was about clinging to sanity through a shared meal on a saint's day or the winding of a useless frozen clock. A desperate, beautiful ritual reminding them that somewhere far beyond this frozen hell, the world was still turning. A quick like and subscribe helps keep these stories alive. Let me know your time zone in the comments, but more importantly, acknowledge your safety. Feel the warmth around you, especially as the holidays draw near. We are about to leave it behind to meet 17 men who were fighting for every degree of heat. Now dim the lights if you can. Maybe adjust your pillow, pull your blanket a little higher. Let your breathing slow. Because we're about to step into a winter that lasted nearly a year, into a night that stretched for months, into a house built from desperation and driftwood on the edge of the known world. The year is 1596. The place is a frozen coast that maps simply labelled as empty space. And the question we're going to answer tonight, slowly, carefully, one breath at a time, is not how these men survived, but why? What made them cling to life when letting go would have been so much easier? What winter survival skills passed down through generations of northern peoples kept their hearts beating when everything else had frozen solid? Close your eyes. Let the centuries dissolve. We are here to learn the oldest skill of all, listening to the dead teach us how to survive. The cold you imagine and the cold they felt are the same ancient enemy reminding us how delicate we truly are. The storm is already battering the walls of Het Behouden Huis. The world is turning white, and the mercy of nature has ended. There are places on Earth where winter is not a season, but a sentence. Where cold is not just a temperature, but a presence, a living thing that presses against wooden walls and searches for any crack, any weakness, any way inside. Novaya Zemlya, in the winter of 1596, was such a place. The name itself means new land in Russian, but there was nothing new about the cold here. This cold was ancient, patient, eternal. Picture, if you can, a coastline so barren that even the stones seem to huddle together for warmth. No trees grow here, though the beach is littered with driftwood, carried by currents from forests 1,000 miles away. Wood that has travelled farther than most men will ever go. The sea, when it's not frozen into a grey plain of broken ice, moves with an oily thickness, as if even the water is reluctant to flow. The sky, in the brief hours when there is sky, and not just darkness, hangs low and colourless, a ceiling of cloud that seems to rest directly on the ice. This is where the men from Amsterdam found themselves in August of 1596, when they realized their ship was not going to escape the grip of the pack ice. Their vessel, which had carried them from the warm canals and brick houses of Holland, was being crushed slowly, methodically, by forces that cared nothing for human ambition or the price of the cargo in its hold. They could hear it at night, the creaking and groaning of wood under impossible pressure, a sound like the ship itself was crying out in pain. But we're not starting our story there in that moment of disaster. We're starting it later, much later, deep in the heart of winter, when the ship is long gone, its timbers repurposed into walls and roof beams, and the 17 men have learned that survival is not about fighting the cold, but about negotiating with it, about finding the narrow space between freezing and suffocating, between darkness and madness, between hope and the seductive comfort of simply giving up. It's perhaps 2 in the morning by the reckoning of their sand glass, though out here time has become abstract. Outside, the temperature is somewhere around 40 degrees, below freezing cold enough that exposed skin will blacken and die in minutes. Cold enough that your breath freezes instantly into tiny crystals that tinkle when they fall. Cold enough that the wooden walls of Het Behouden Huis, despite being packed with moss and sand and covered with spare sailcloth, are covered on the inside with a thick layer of frost. In the dim light of a seal oil lamp, this frost glitters like the walls are studded with diamonds. It would be beautiful if it weren't evidence of how desperately cold it is, how the very moisture of their breath freezes the moment it touches anything. Inside the house, which measures perhaps 30 feet by 20 feet, 17 men occupy a space that would feel cramped for a family of 4. They sleep in shifts, their bodies packed together on a raised platform built along the walls, using their collective warmth as a kind of living furnace. Those who are awake tend the fire in the central hearth, a fire that must be kept burning constantly, but never too hot, because they learned weeks ago that a fire too vigorous will consume all the oxygen and leave them gasping, or worse, fill the house with invisible smoke that puts them to sleep forever. This is the art they've mastered through trial and terrible error. Not the art of comfort, but the art of existing in the thin margin between death by cold and death by warmth. It's a winter survival skill that ancient peoples of the north understood instinctively, that the Sami and the Inuit and the northern Russians had perfected over millennia. But for these Dutch sailors, it had to be learned in real time with real consequences. One man, perhaps, it's Jacob van Heemskerk, the captain who must maintain discipline even as the world outside reduces every hierarchy to the simple truth that we are all equally vulnerable to the cold, sits by the fire with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Not a proper blanket, but a piece of damaged sail stitched together with fishing line. He's whittling a piece of driftwood, not making anything in particular, just keeping his hands busy, because idle hands lead to idle thoughts, and idle thoughts in this place can spiral quickly into despair. The sound of his knife against wood is rhythmic, almost meditative. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It's one of the few sounds inside the house besides the occasional pop of green wood in the fire, the whisper of sleeping men's breathing, and the endless howl of wind outside. The wind here is not like wind, you know. It doesn't gust and fade. It maintains a constant pressure, a steady roar that becomes the soundtrack of your existence. After weeks, you stop hearing it as a sound and start feeling it as a presence, as if the wind has weight and intention. Sometimes, in his darker moments, Heemskerk imagines the wind is actually trying to communicate, trying to explain in its wordless roar why the world up here is the way it is. Why mercy is a concept that only exists in places where the sun comes back reliably. Another man, perhaps it's Gerrit de Veer, the ship's carpenter, who will later write the account that allows us to know any of this happened, lies on the sleeping platform with his eyes open, watching the frost patterns on the ceiling beams. He's memorizing them, because memory is all they have up here. Memory of warmth. Memory of Amsterdam's streets crowded with merchants and the smell of fresh bread. Memory of his wife's face. Though that's getting harder to picture clearly as the months wear on. He knows he needs to remember these frost patterns too, because someday, if there is a someday, people will ask what it was like, and he needs to be able to tell them. Not the big dramatic things, but the small true things, like how frost grows in feather patterns that look like wings, like how the house smells of unwashed bodies and seal blubber and damp wool, a smell so thick you could almost cut it, like how the cold has a taste metallic and sharp that coats the back of your throat. De Veer thinks about the house they're lying in, this structure they built from desperation and necessity. When they constructed it back in September, when there was still some daylight to work by, it seemed like such an achievement. They'd found driftwood on the beach, massive logs carried by Arctic currents from the forests of Siberia, and they'd hauled these logs across the frozen ground, using ropes and their own diminishing strength. They disassembled parts of the doomed ship, pulling nails with numbed fingers, saving every scrap of timber and canvas and rope, because up here there is no hardware store, no lumber yard, no possibility of running to town for supplies. What you have is what you have. When it's gone, you die. They'd built the house in the style of a northern cabin logs, notched and fitted together gaps stuffed with whatever they could find, moss and sand, and torn sailcloth, anything to keep the wind from finding its way through. They'd built a chimney from bricks salvaged from the ship's galley, mortared with a mixture of clay, dug from the beach and their own desperation. They'd constructed a door that faced away from the prevailing wind, and covered it with a double layer of canvas, because wood alone wasn't enough to keep the cold at bay. They'd built sleeping platforms raised off the floor, because even here, where everything freezes, heat rises. And the difference between sleeping 6 inches higher might be the difference between waking up in the morning or not waking up at all. The house has a single room. Privacy is a luxury that belongs to another world. 17 men eat, sleep, argue, pray, defecate into a bucket kept in the corner that must be emptied every day, and slowly go mad together in this one small space. And yet, paradoxically, this lack of privacy is also what saves them. Because when the cold seeps through every defense, when the fire burns low in the middle of the night, when one man wakes shivering so hard his teeth chatter like dice in a cup, there are other men there close enough to share their warmth to throw another log on the fire to remind him that he's not alone. This is the truth that Het Behouden Huis teaches. That survival is not an individual achievement, but a collective one. That in the arithmetic of extreme cold, one person alone will always lose, but 17 together might find a way. It's a truth as old as humanity itself, this understanding that we are stronger together. But it's a truth these Dutch merchants and sailors are learning anew in the hardest classroom imaginable. Outside, the wind shifts slightly, and a drift of snow slides down the roof with a soft whisper. Inside, a man in his sleep makes a small sound, not quite a word, not quite a cry. Another man reaches out without opening his eyes and places a hand on his shoulder, a gesture so automatic it might be instinct, this reaching out to reassure, to anchor, to remind. We are here. We are still here. The winter is long, but we are still here. And for now, in this moment, at 2 in the morning, on a date that might be December, but might be January, it's hard to tell anymore. That's enough. Being here. Being alive. Waiting for a spring that seems more like a fairy tale with each passing day, but still somewhere deep in the human heart, believed in. Because without that belief, there would be no reason to keep feeding the fire, no reason to wake up when sleep would be so much easier. No reason to continue the exhausting, mundane, essential work of staying alive. Let your mind settle now into the interior of Het Behouden Huis, into the lived reality of this space. Not the romantic idea of an Arctic shelter, but the actual physical truth of it. The way it smells, the way it sounds, the way it feels against your skin. The first thing that strikes you is how small it is. 30 feet by 20 feet, roughly the size of a modern one-car garage. And in this space live 17 men with all their possessions, their food stores, their tools, their fears and hopes, and slowly fraying sanity. The ceiling is low enough that a tall man must duck when moving about. The floor is hard-packed frozen earth, covered in places with boards salvaged from the ship. These boards are worn smooth from months of pacing, from restless men walking circles in the night, because lying still in the darkness makes the walls feel like they're closing in. The sleeping platform runs along the north and east walls, raised about 2 feet off the ground. It's covered with whatever they could find that might provide insulation between their bodies and the cold. Sailcloth torn blankets, sheepskin jackets turned inside out, even spare canvas from the ship's stores. Some men sleep on bags stuffed with dried grass they gathered before the true winter set in, though by now the grass has been compressed into dense, uncomfortable lumps. The platform is divided into informal territories, each man claiming a space roughly the width of his shoulders, and these territories are defended with the kind of intensity that comes from having very little else to call your own. The central hearth dominates the room. It's a raised platform built from stones and bricks with a chimney that rises straight up through the roof. The fire burning there is small, almost timid nothing, like the roaring fires of a Dutch winter hearthside back home. This is a controlled burn, carefully rationed, because the driftwood they collected must last until spring, and spring is an eternity away. The wood they burn is often still frozen when it goes into the fire, and it sputters and hisses and produces more smoke than heat smoke that should go up the chimney, but often doesn't. Instead, pooling near the ceiling in a grey haze that stings the eyes. Around the hearth are scattered the implements of survival. A cast iron pot for melting snow into drinking water, because you can't eat snow directly without your core temperature dropping dangerously. A collection of tin cups, each man with his own, because these small possessions, these markers of individual identity, become precious beyond measure. A wooden box containing their remaining provisions, mostly ship's biscuits, that are now so hard they must be soaked in water before eating salted meat that's mostly salt by now. A few preserved lemons that Willem Barentsz insists they ration carefully because he's read somewhere that citrus prevents some disease of the gums, though none of them truly understand why. In one corner stands a small table, really just a board balanced on two barrels. This is where Gerrit de Veer keeps his journal and navigational instruments. The journal itself is remarkable, a testament to discipline. Every day, even when nothing happens, even when each day is identical to the one before and the one after, de Veer makes an entry. The date, the weather, if it can be called weather, and not just endless variations of terrible cold, any notable events, though notable events are rare. The journal is written in Dutch in a careful hand that gets shakier as the months progress, as if the cold is seeping into his fingers even as he writes. The navigational instruments are there because they remain sailors, even in this frozen prison men who understand the world through sextants and compasses and the movement of stars. Though up here the stars are often invisible, hidden by clouds, or simply absent during the long dark that swallows everything from November through January. Still, the instruments remain polished and maintained, as if their care is a prayer, a way of telling themselves that they will need these tools again, that there will be a day when they return to the sea. Against one wall leans their collection of weapons, muskets that must be kept near the fire so the gunpowder doesn't get damp, pikes and knives, even a harpoon they took from the ship. These weapons are not decorative. Out there in the dark are polar bears. The men have learned to recognize the warning signs of a bear's approach. The way the wind changes, carrying a smell of musk and fish. The way the sled dogs, if they're still outside, will begin to bark with a particular frantic pitch. Bears are curious creatures, and the house with its smoke and sounds and smells is an object of fascination. They circle it at night, sometimes scratching at the walls, and the sound of claws on wood is enough to wake even the deepest sleeper to reach for a weapon. Hanging from the ceiling beams are various items they've tried to keep dry and away from the floor. Extra clothing, what little they have. Some furs they've managed to collect from trapped Arctic foxes, though they're amateur trappers at best, and the foxes are wilier than they anticipated. A few books precious beyond gold up here. The Bible, of course, read aloud during their evening gatherings, as a way of maintaining some structure, some connection to the life they left behind. But also a book of stories, something secular. And the pages of this book are soft now from being handled by men desperate for any escape from their current reality. The light in the house comes from two sources. The fire, which casts a flickering orange glow that makes shadows dance on the frost-covered walls in patterns that can seem almost alive. And a whale oil lamp, a precious item because whale oil burns cleaner than seal fat and produces less acrid smoke. But they use it sparingly, only when someone needs to see clearly, to perform some task, to read or write or mend torn clothing. The rest of the time they live in firelight and shadow in a dim world where faces are only half visible, and it's easy to imagine you're somewhere else, someone else. The sounds inside the house create their own rhythm. The fire's constant whisper, the settling creaks of wood contracting in the cold, a sound that never stops, as if the house itself is alive and breathing. The snores and sighs of sleeping men, each man with his own sleep, sounds that the others have learned to distinguish. De Vere grinds his teeth. Heemskerk talks in his sleep, muttering about calculations and courses. Another man, whose name we don't know because he doesn't survive to return home, weeps sometimes soft sounds that he probably doesn't know he makes. And through it all, penetrating every moment, the wind. Sometimes it howls like an animal in pain. Sometimes it moans like a mourner at a grave. Sometimes it simply roars a white noise so constant that your ears begin to create patterns in it. Phantom sounds that aren't really there. Music that doesn't exist. Voices calling from outside. More than one man has gone to the door, certain he heard someone calling for help, only to find nothing but darkness and snow and cold that hits like a physical blow. This is their world now. These 30 feet by 20 feet. These walls of driftwood and hope. This small fire that must be fed carefully, but never too much. These other men who were strangers in Amsterdam, but who now know each other more intimately than family, who know the sound of each other's breathing, the smell of each other's bodies, the particular way each man moves in the night. In this space, they've established routines, because routine is what keeps humans human. Each man has his duties assigned and rotated so that no one feels the burden unfairly. Someone tends the fire at all times. Someone keeps the sand glass running so they don't completely lose track of time. Someone checks the door seals every evening to make sure snow hasn't drifted against it and blocked their only exit. Someone boils the water. Someone maintains the weapons. Someone reads aloud from the Bible or the book of stories. These tasks, mundane as they are, become sacred because they provide structure in a place where time has no meaning. Because they give purpose when it would be so easy to simply lie down on the sleeping platform and wait for the cold to take you. Because doing them is an act of defiance, a way of saying to the universe that has trapped you here, you have not beaten us yet. And so the men of Het Behouden Huis continue. They wake, they tend the fire, they melt snow for water, they eat their rations, they maintain their tools, they read their books, they talk quietly because loud sounds feel wrong in this place, and they wait. They wait for the sun to return, an event that seems increasingly unlikely as the darkness stretches on and on. They wait for rescue, though they know rationally that no ship will come until spring at the earliest. They wait for spring itself, for some sign that the world has not frozen permanently, that this winter will eventually end. And in the waiting, something remarkable happens. These men who came here as individuals, as separate selves, with separate goals, begin to merge into something else. Not losing their identities exactly, but finding a new identity that encompasses them all. They become, without quite realizing it, a single organism dedicated to survival. When one man is too cold, another shares his blanket without being asked. When someone is too discouraged to eat his ration, another coaxes him gently, because they all understand that the death of one diminishes them all. when someone forgets what day it is, what month, whether they've been here 3 months or 3 years, another reminds him, patiently grounding him back in reality. This is the great and terrible gift of het behouden huis. It strips away everything extraneous and reveals what humans really are at their core. Not the civilized merchants of Amsterdam, not the skilled sailors who knew every rope and sail, but animals who need warmth and food and companionship, who will endure incredible hardship if given a reason to hope, who will care for each other even when caring requires giving up some of their own comfort, who will maintain their humanity in the face of inhumane conditions, because humanity is not something you have, but something you do day after cold day, hour after dark hour. Look around this space one more time before we move on. Feel how the cold presses against every surface. Smell the thick air, the blend of smoke and bodies and damp wool. Hear the wind that never stops, and the fire that whispers its own small defiance. See the faces of men who have been here too long, faces made gaunt by rationed food and etched by constant cold, but faces that still show determination, still show that flicker of hope that tomorrow might be different, that spring will come, that they will survive to tell this story. This is where they live. This is where they wait. This is where they discover what they're truly made of. The physics of cold at this latitude is not something you study. It's something you survive. And the men in het behouden huis have become unwilling experts in a branch of science that wouldn't have formal names for another 3 centuries. They understand thermodynamics through the brutal education of experience. They know things about heat transfer and insulation and the relationship between oxygen and combustion that university professors in Amsterdam would struggle to explain, but that these men grasp with the clarity that comes from knowing that getting it wrong means death. Let's talk about the cold itself, because cold this extreme is not simply the absence of warmth. It's a presence, an entity, something that feels almost malicious in its persistence. At 40 degrees below freezing, which is a temperature the men encounter regularly, exposed skin begins to freeze in less than 5 minutes. But the danger isn't just frostbite. It's that the cold does something to the very nature of matter. Metal becomes brittle. The hinges on their door made of iron creak and groan when moved because the metal has lost its flexibility. If you strike a metal object too hard in this cold, it can shatter like glass. They've learned this the hard way when a knife blade broke during a repair job, the steel simply snapping when torqued at the wrong angle. Wood becomes strange too. It contracts in the cold, and you can hear it happening. All through the night, the walls pop and crack as the timbers shrink, and every crack lets in a little more wind, a little more cold. Then when they build up the fire and the interior warms slightly, the wood expands again, and the whole house creaks and groans like a living thing in pain. After months of this, gaps have opened in places that were once tight, and they must constantly stuff new material into these gaps, an endless battle against entropy. Liquids freeze in unexpected ways. The wine they brought from the ship is now solid in its casks, useless, unless they chip pieces off and melt them by the fire. Even their drinking water kept in barrels near the hearth will develop a skin of ice overnight if the fire burns too low. They've learned to break this ice before drinking to check that the water underneath is still liquid, because swallowing ice chips will drop your core temperature and make you colder from the inside out. the cold does something to air as well. When they open the door even briefly to throw out waste, or check the weather, or investigate a suspicious sound, the cold air rushes in like water pouring across the floor in a wave. They can actually see a shimmer of supercooled air that sinks because it's denser than the warm air inside. This cold flood can lower the interior temperature several degrees in seconds, and they've learned to move fast when the door is open to do what needs doing and seal it again before too much warmth escapes. But here's the paradox: they've discovered the terrible equation that governs their existence. They need the fire to stay warm, but the fire consumes oxygen. In a sealed space like Het Behouden Huis, this becomes a matter of life and death. Too much fire, too many logs burning at once, and the oxygen level drops. The men begin to feel tired, sluggish. Their thinking becomes fuzzy. Their lips and fingernails turn blue. They don't realize they're suffocating, because suffocation from oxygen depletion doesn't feel like drowning. It feels like being very, very tired. Like you just need to lie down for a moment. And if you do lie down, you might not wake up. They learned this lesson on December 7th, 1596, a date etched in their collective memory with the clarity of trauma. It was a particularly cold day, and they'd sealed every crack, stuffed every gap, desperate to keep the warmth inside. They'd built up the fire larger than usual, burning precious wood, because the alternative was freezing. And then gradually, they started feeling strange. De Vere recorded it in his journal. Men became lightheaded. Some complained of headaches. Others simply sat down heavily as if their legs had stopped working. One man vomited. Another passed out cold. There was confusion, arguments about what was happening. Was it some Arctic sickness? Had they eaten spoiled food? Was this a plague sent by God? And then Willem Barentsz, the navigator whose knowledge extended beyond sailing into natural philosophy, understood. The fire was consuming their air. They were suffocating in their own shelter. He forced the door open, and men who could still move stumbled outside into air so cold it seared their lungs. But at least it was air-blessed, oxygen-rich air. They stood in the killing cold, gasping and shaking, knowing they were freezing, but also knowing they were alive. Inside the house, unconscious men began to stir as fresh air flooded in. They'd come within minutes of dying, all of them killed not by the cold, but by their attempt to escape the cold. After that day, they redesigned their ventilation system. They drilled small holes near the ceiling to let smoke and carbon dioxide escape. They learned to read the fire differently, to understand that a bright, hot blaze might be too much, that sometimes a smaller smoke eye fire is safer. They learned to watch each other for the signs of oxygen depletion, that glassy-eyed look, that stumbling gait, the way someone might sit down and seem unable to get back up. When they saw these signs, someone would open the door just a crack, just for a moment, enough to let in fresh air, even if it meant letting in cold. This balancing act, this constant negotiation between freezing and suffocating, is one of the most sophisticated winter survival skills they've developed. It's not written in any book. It's not taught in any school. It's discovered through trial and error, and the errors are nearly fatal. But they've learned it, internalized it, made it second nature. Now, even in sleep, some part of their consciousness monitors the fire nose, without being told when it's time to add a log or time to crack the door for air. The weather outside is its own adversary. Wind speeds at this latitude during winter storms can exceed 100 miles per hour. This is not a wind you can stand in. It's a wind that will knock you down, steal your breath, and bury you in snow before you can find your way back to shelter. They've learned not to go outside during these storms no matter what. Even if a bear is scratching at the walls, even if they need to retrieve something urgently, they wait. Because the stories of Arctic exploration are full of men who stepped outside in a storm and were never seen again, found months later, just yards from safety, frozen solid, with expressions of confusion on their faces, as if they couldn't understand how they'd gotten lost in such a short distance. The snow here is different from snow in gentler climates. It's dry, almost like powder, because the air is too cold to hold moisture. This snow doesn't pack well, doesn't make good snowballs or snow shelters, but it drifts with incredible efficiency, piling up against any obstacle, including the walls of het behouden huis. They must regularly dig out the door, a task that requires venturing into the cold with shovels made from barrel staves, working quickly to clear a path before frostbite sets in. More than once they've woken to find the door completely blocked the house, buried under several feet of drift, and they've had to dig upward through the chimney to escape a terrifying experience that leaves them all shaken. The darkness is its own form of weather. From November through January, the sun never rises above the horizon. There is a brief period around midday when the sky might lighten slightly, a deep blue twilight that lasts an hour or two, but most of each day is full night. This darkness does something to the human mind that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. It's not just the absence of light. It's the weight of that absence, the way darkness becomes a physical presence that presses down on you, that makes the walls feel closer, the ceiling lower, the air harder to breathe. They've developed strategies to combat this darkness. They keep a lamp burning through the night, even though it consumes precious fuel. The small circle of light it creates becomes a kind of sanctuary, a reminder that light exists, that the world hasn't ended. They tell stories, long rambling tales of Amsterdam and the sea of voyages they've made, and people they've known anything to fill the darkness with words, with human voice, with memory of sunlight. And they wait for January the 24th, the date by Barentz's calculations when the sun should return. They've been counting the days, marking them off on a plank of wood. With a knife, each mark a small victory another day survived. The anticipation of the sun's return becomes almost unbearable. Will it really come back? Or have they miscalculated and the darkness will last forever? When the day arrives, they all gather outside in the bitter cold, staring at the southern horizon, waiting. And then, impossibly, there it is. Just a sliver of gold, the upper rim of the sun peeking over the edge of the world. It lasts only minutes, this apparition, before sinking back below the horizon. But those minutes are enough. The men weep openly and without shame. They embrace each other, laughing and crying at the same time. Because the sun's return is not just light. It's proof that the world still works, that seasons still change, that winter will end. It's hope made visible. What they don't know, what they can't know because the physics hasn't been discovered yet, is that they're witnessing a phenomenon that will later be named the Novaya Zemlya effect. The sun they're seeing is still technically below the horizon, but atmospheric refraction is bending its light, allowing them to see it days earlier than geometry would predict. The cold air is creating temperature inversions that act like a lens bending light rays around the curve of the Earth. They're seeing an impossible thing made possible by the very cold that has been trying to kill them for months. There's a poetry in that, though they won't live to know the science that explains it. From this day forward, the sun returns for a few more minutes each day, climbing slowly back into their world. The darkness begins to retreat. And with the light comes a subtle change in the men themselves. They move more purposefully. They speak more hopefully. The walls of Het Behouden Huis don't feel quite so close, because now they can see spring in their minds again, not as a fantasy, but as a real destination, something they might actually reach. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're still in the deep winter, in the dark months, when survival is a matter of understanding the physics of cold, and the chemistry of combustion, and the psychology of hope. Where knowing how to balance fire and air and shelter means the difference between seeing another sunrise or becoming another frozen body that won't be found until archaeologists arrive centuries later. This is history to fall asleep, to yes, but it's also a reminder of what the human body and human will can endure when there's no alternative. These men are not superheroes. They're ordinary sailors, merchants, adventurers. They're cold and scared and tired beyond measure. But they understand something fundamental that their comfortable lives in Amsterdam never taught them. That survival is not about being strong or brave. It's about being patient, being attentive, being willing to help the man next to you even when you can barely help yourself. It's about making the right small decisions 1,000 times a day, every day, until the winter finally releases its grip. Sleep in Het Behouden Huis is not rest. It's another form of survival, another challenge to be managed and negotiated. Because sleep, that most natural of human activities, becomes complicated when every breath you take produces moisture that freezes on your blanket, when lying still means getting colder, when nightmares about ice and death are indistinguishable from waking reality. The sleeping platform runs along 2 walls of the house, elevated about 2 feet off the frozen ground. This elevation is crucial because cold air sinks pooling on the floor like an invisible lake, and sleeping at floor level would be suicide. But even raised, the platform offers only marginal protection from the cold that seeps up from the permafrost below, that infiltrates through the walls, that seems to emanate from the very air itself. Each man has his designated sleeping space, a rectangle roughly 3 feet wide and 6 feet long, marked out with the precision of sailors accustomed to the tight quarters of a ship's berth. In these spaces, the men have created small nests of whatever materials they can scavenge for warmth. Sailcloth forms the base layer, old canvas that still smells of salt water and Amsterdam docks. On top of this, they've layered whatever they could find: spare clothing, torn blankets, pieces of fur from the Arctic foxes they've managed to trap, even dried grass they collected before winter, though by now it's compressed into a hard mat that provides more psychological comfort than actual insulation. The blankets themselves are an issue. What they brought from the ship are wool blankets intended for a Dutch winter, not an Arctic one. After months, these blankets are stiff with accumulated frost from their breath and body heat. Each morning, a man wakes to find his blanket crusted with ice on the inside ice that has formed from the moisture of his own exhalations. They've learned to shake these blankets out by the fire before sleeping again to melt the frost and dry the wool as much as possible, but it's a temporary solution. By morning, the ice returns. The men sleep in their clothes, every layer they own, including their heavy coats and multiple pairs of stockings. The idea of undressing for bed is laughable here. Nakedness would mean death within the hour. So they sleep fully clothed, and over time these clothes become part of their bodies, rarely removed, growing stiffer with dirt and sweat. And the peculiar smell that all of them share now, a smell of unwashed wool and seal fat and smoke and human desperation. The mechanics of staying warm while sleeping require constant adjustment. Lying on your back means your back gets cold. Lying on your side means your lower hip and shoulder freeze first, grinding into the hard surface beneath you. So the men shift constantly through the night, turning from side to back to other side, in a rhythm that becomes automatic. Some nights, when it's particularly cold, you can hear this shifting 15 or 16 bodies, all turning at roughly the same time, as if choreographed by the cold itself. Body heat is shared without discussion or modesty. Men sleep pressed against each other back to front, sharing warmth in configurations that would be unthinkable in any other context. A man might wake to find himself curved around another man's back, or wake to feel someone pressed against his own spine. And this is not intimacy. It's mathematics, the simple equation that two bodies generate more heat than one. Pride is a luxury for warmer places. The sleeping arrangements are not democratic. The coldest spots on the platform, those nearest the walls where the frost penetrates most aggressively, are assigned to the younger, stronger men who can better tolerate the extra chill. The spots nearest the center, closest to the fire's radial heat, are given to the older men, to those who are sick, to Willem Barentsz, whose health has been declining steadily, and who needs every advantage to stay alive. This is not discussed, but it's understood, one of those unspoken agreements that defines how the group functions. Some men are fortunate enough to have fur garments they've fashioned from the Arctic foxes they've trapped. Fox fur is remarkable stuff adapted by millions of years of evolution to survive exactly this cold. It's dense, with a thick underlayer of fine fur beneath longer guard hairs, and it creates pockets of trapped air that act as insulation. A man with a fox fur hat and mittens is warmer than one without a difference that can mean keeping all your fingers versus losing some to frostbite. So the men have become amateur furriers, crudely stitching furs into hats, mittens, boot liners, anything that might provide an extra layer between skin and cold. But sleep itself, the actual act of losing consciousness and drifting into dreams, is dangerous here in ways that go beyond the cold. Because the border between sleep and death is narrow at these temperatures. A man who falls asleep too cold might simply not wake up. His body, already operating at the edge of its capacity, might cross some invisible threshold while unconscious, and his metabolism might slow and slow until it simply stops. They've learned to watch for this, to check on each other through the night. If a man is sleeping too deeply, too still, someone will shake him awake, make him move, make him drink a cup of warm water, because stillness and cold are a fatal combination. The dreams they have in this place are strange and vivid, a mixture of memory and hallucination. De Vere dreams of Amsterdam streets so real he can smell the bread baking and hear the church bells. Then he dreams of ice, endless ice, and he's walking on it, knowing the ice is thin but unable to stop. Heemskerk dreams of ships, always ships sailing through impossible waters, and he's at the helm, but the wheel won't turn and there's an iceberg ahead, but his hands are frozen to the wheel and he can't steer away. Other men dream of fire, great consuming fires that seem like salvation until they realize they're burning, and they wake gasping, not sure if they're hot or cold or dead. These dreams bleed into waking life. Sometimes a man will be awake, but not realize it sitting by the fire, carrying on a conversation with someone who isn't there, or at least isn't there anymore. Might be back in Amsterdam, might be dead. It's hard to say. The others have learned not to startle someone in this state, but to speak gently to bring them back to reality slowly. Because a man startled from a waking dream might lash out, might grab a weapon, might, in his confusion, do something dangerous. The question of when to sleep and when to be awake has become complicated by the absence of day and night. Back in Amsterdam, you sleep when it's dark and wake when it's light, a pattern set by the sun and reinforced by every aspect of human society. But here it's always dark or nearly so. The men have tried to maintain a schedule to designate certain hours as night and certain hours as day, using their hourglasses to mark the passage of time. But it's arbitrary, this division, and increasingly difficult to maintain. Why not sleep when you're tired and wake when you're not? What difference does it make whether it's supposed to be 2 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon when both are equally dark and equally cold? So sleep becomes fragmented, distributed across the day in chunks. A man might sleep for 3 hours, then be awake for 5, then sleep for 2 more. This pattern is exhausting in its own way, because you never get that deep, restorative sleep that comes from a full night's rest. You're always partly awake, always partly dreaming, always somewhere in between. And after weeks of this, the mental fog becomes thick and difficult to penetrate. They use firewatch as a way to impose structure. 2 men are always designated to be fully awake and attentive, tending the fire, watching for danger, maintaining the vigil that keeps them all alive. These watches rotate, so everyone takes their turn and the watch is treated with appropriate seriousness. To fall asleep on watch is not just a personal failing. It's a betrayal of the group, because the fire can't be allowed to go out, and threats don't sleep just because you're tired. The fire watch sits by the hearth with a blanket around their shoulders, occasionally adding a small log to keep the flames steady but not too high. They listen to the wind and the creaking house and the breathing of their companions. They maintain the hourglasses, flipping them when the sand runs out, keeping track of time, even though time has become mostly meaningless. They think their private thoughts, memories of home that are both comfort and torture plans for the future, that seem increasingly unlikely prayers to a God who might have forgotten them in this frozen wasteland. Sometimes the watch will wake a sleeping man to share a conversation, because the loneliness of being the only person awake in a house full of sleeping men can be overwhelming. They'll wake someone gently and share a cup of melted snow water warmed by the fire, and they'll talk quietly about nothing important. The weather, though, it never changes. The food stores, though, they know exactly what's left. Plans for spring. Though spring might as well be another universe. The conversation isn't important. It's the act of talking, of hearing another human voice and responding that matters. It's a reminder that they're not alone, that they're all in this together, that survival is a collective project. And when their watch ends, and they lie down to sleep themselves, they do so with the knowledge that someone else is now awake watching, keeping the fire alive, keeping the cold at bay for another few hours. It's a trust so fundamental it doesn't require acknowledgement. We take turns keeping each other alive. That's the agreement. That's the unspoken contract that governs life in het behouden huis. So they sleep, fitfully and incompletely, on their hard platform in their frozen clothes, under their icy blankets pressed against each other for warmth, dreaming dreams they'll half remember in the morning, and they wake to find themselves still alive, still together, still enduring. And that's enough. For now, that's enough. The evening routine in het behouden huis has become sacred, a series of small rituals that divide the endless darkness into manageable pieces, that give shape and meaning to days that would otherwise blur into an undifferentiated grey of cold and waiting. These routines are not grand gestures, but humble, repetitive tasks, performed with the kind of attention that transforms the mundane into the essential. As what they've designated as evening approaches, marked by the hourglass, rather than any change in the light outside, the men begin their preparations for the long night ahead. Though in truth, calling it the long night is misleading, because all nights are long here, and all days are nights, and the distinction between them is maintained only through sheer force of collective will. The first task is securing the house. One of the younger sailors steps outside to clear snow and check the door seals, a dreaded duty. When the door opens, Arctic air floods in, reminding everyone how thin the walls really are. Bundled in furs and scarves, he still feels the cold bite instantly. Outside, tears freeze on his cheeks as he works fast, clearing the threshold and checking the chimney, knowing that even a small mistake could make the night inside unbearable. The wind up here is always moving, always searching. It finds the exposed skin between his scarf and his hat, and feels like knives cutting into his flesh. His fingers, even inside thick mittens, begin to go numb almost immediately. He's learned to watch for the white patches that indicate the beginning of frostbite, and when he sees them, he presses his bare hand against his stomach, under all his layers, trying to rewarm the skin before permanent damage sets in. This is a winter survival skill learned the hard way after they lost partial fingers and toes in the early months. To frostbite, they didn't understand how to prevent. When he comes back inside, he carries a bucket of clean snow. They need water for drinking and cooking, and obtaining water means melting snow, which means collecting it. The snow here is clean, almost preternaturally pure, with none of the dirt or pollution that might contaminate snow falling on Amsterdam's streets. But it's also incredibly cold, and the act of melting it consumes precious fuel. A bucket of snow reduces to just a few cups of water, a ratio that seems impossible until you understand how much air is trapped in snow's crystalline structure. The water detail is another evening task. Someone must take the snow and melt it in the iron pot that sits beside the fire. This is tedious work requiring patience as the snow slowly collapses into slush and then into water. The water must then be boiled, not because they understand germ theory that's still centuries away, but because hot water warms you from the inside in a way that cold water doesn't. They've learned that drinking warm fluids helps maintain body temperature, another lesson in practical thermodynamics, taught by experience rather than textbooks. While the water is melting, others prepare the evening meal. Meal is perhaps too generous a word for what they eat. Their supplies are dwindling, rationed carefully to last until spring, and each man knows exactly what his portion will be. A piece of ship's biscuit so hard it must be soaked in the warm water to become edible. A small strip of salted meat, the salt so concentrated it burns the tongue. Sometimes a spoonful of oats boiled into a thin gruel. On special occasions, when morale is particularly low, or when they've designated it a saint's day worthy of celebration, they might add a dried lemon to the pot, allowing the precious citrus to flavor the water and provide what Willem Barentsz insists is protection against the disease of the gums that has started to plague some of the men. The cooking is done with care, not because the food is good, it's not, but because the ritual of preparation is important. The men take turns as cook, and each one approaches the task with the seriousness it deserves, measuring out the portions exactly, making sure no man receives less than his fair share, adding the ingredients to the pot in the correct order, stirring with a wooden spoon worn smooth from months of use. These actions are predictable, repetitive, boring, and absolutely essential for maintaining the social order that keeps them from descending into chaos. While some men cook, others perform maintenance on their clothing and equipment. Clothing is constantly damaged by the cold and the rough conditions. Stitches come loose, fabric tears, furs need to be resewn. So the men sit by the fire with needle and thread, mending as best they can with fingers that are stiff and clumsy from the cold. This is not skilled tailoring. These are rough repairs, clumsy stitches made by men who were sailors, not seamstresses. But the work serves multiple purposes. It keeps the clothing functional, it keeps the hands busy, and it provides a focus, a task to concentrate on. That's not just sitting and thinking about how cold you are, how hungry, how frightened. The weapons must be maintained too. The muskets they brought from the ship require regular cleaning to prevent rust and to ensure they'll fire when needed. They clean the barrels carefully, checking the flints, making sure the powder is dry. The pikes and knives are sharpened, not because they've been used recently, but because the act of sharpening them is both practical and symbolic. These tools represent their ability to defend themselves, to hunt, to fight back against the bears that circle the house. Maintaining them is a way of maintaining hope. As the evening progresses, one of the men, usually Gerrit de Veer, but sometimes another who can read well, will take out a book. They have so few books here. The Bible, which is read aloud frequently, its familiar passages a connection to the world they left behind. And a book of secular tales, stories of adventure and romance that seem to come from another universe entirely. The reader sits near the lamp where the light is best, and he reads slowly, enunciating clearly, so everyone can hear over the wind and the fire. The other men listen with an attention that would seem strange in any other context. These are adults, hardened sailors, and merchants hanging on every word of stories they've heard multiple times before. But up here, stories are not entertainment. They're survival equipment. They transport the mind away from the present suffering, provide a few moments of escape into worlds where people aren't cold, where the sun shines, where there are women and children and warm houses and full meals. When the reading is finished, the men discuss the story debate. Details argue gently about character motivations, stretching the conversation out as long as possible, because the conversation itself is valuable, a way of keeping their minds active and engaged. Before sleep, there is prayer. This is not negotiable. Every evening they gather as best they can in the cramped space, and someone, usually Captain Heemskirk, leads them in prayer. They pray for delivery for the ice to release its grip, for the sun to return fully, for spring to come. They pray for their families back in Amsterdam, for the wives and children and parents who surely believe them dead by now. They pray for the souls of the men they've already lost, for those who died in the early weeks when they didn't yet understand how to survive here. They pray for strength to endure another day, another week, another month. The prayers are heartfelt, but also pragmatic. These men are not particularly devout under normal circumstances. They're merchant sailors, practical men who deal in trade goods and navigation charts. But extreme conditions create their own theology, and in the face of forces completely beyond their control, prayer becomes both comfort and protest, a way of asserting that they still believe in meaning, in purpose, in the possibility of rescue or redemption. After prayer, the house is checked one last time. The night fire watch is set, 2 men staying awake while the others sleep. The fire is stacked to burn for hours, the door sealed again, weapons kept within reach. The hourglasses are turned, and the night begins. And then finally, the men retire to their sleeping platform. There's a practiced efficiency to this, bodies arranging themselves in the order that maximizes warmth, men settling into the spaces they've occupied for months, pulling their frozen blankets over themselves, pressing together in configurations that have become routine. The murmur of conversation continues for a while. Quiet exchanges between men lying side by side until gradually the voices fade and sleep claims them one by one. The 2 men on fire watch sit by the hearth wrapped in their blankets, beginning their long vigil. They don't talk much during these watches. There's a companionable silence that comes from shared duty, shared danger. They stare into the fire, watching the flames dance, occasionally adding a log when needed. They listen to the wind and the house and the sleeping men. They keep the world at bay for another night. This is how they survive. Not through heroic action or brilliant strategy, but through routine, through the faithful execution of small tasks, through taking care of each other in ways so basic they barely require acknowledgement. They melt snow into water. They cook their meager rations. They mend their clothes. They read their stories. They say their prayers. They stand their watches. Day after day, week after week, month after month, they perform these rituals, and the rituals keep them human, keep them connected, keep them alive. It's not glamorous. There are no medals awarded for melting snow or mending a torn mitten. But this is the reality of survival in extreme conditions. It's not about the big moments. It's about the accumulation of small moments, small victories, small acts of care and attention that add up over time to the difference between living and dying. There's a particular quality to the darkness that settles over Novaya Zemlya during the polar night, a darkness that seems to have weight and texture and intention. It's not merely the absence of light. It's a presence, a force that presses against the thin walls of Het Behoudenhuis and seeps into the minds of the men inside, changing them in ways both subtle and profound. In Amsterdam, darkness is temporary, bounded by the certain knowledge that morning will come. Even on the longest winter nights, you go to sleep, knowing that in a few hours the sun will rise and the world will be visible again. Your mind accepts this darkness because it knows it's finite, manageable part of the natural rhythm of day and night that has governed human existence since humans first opened their eyes to the world. But here, in the deep Arctic winter darkness, is different. It stretches on week after week, month after month, with no sun to break its grip. The darkness of November becomes the darkness of December, becomes the darkness of January, and each day is indistinguishable from the one before. Time, which humans measure primarily by the movement of the sun across the sky, becomes abstract. The hourglasses they use to track hours and days are props in a play they're performing for themselves, arbitrary markers in a universe that has stopped making sense. The psychological effect of this unending night cannot be overstated. Modern researchers studying people who work in Antarctic stations during the polar night have documented something they call the winter over syndrome, a constellation of symptoms including depression, irritability, insomnia, paradoxically accompanied by constant fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and a kind of emotional numbing, where things that would normally provoke strong reactions provoke nothing at all. The men in Het Behouden Huis in 1596 don't have terminology for what they're experiencing, but they're experiencing it nonetheless. De Vere notes in his journal that some men become unnaturally quiet, going days without speaking except when directly addressed. Others become volatile, snapping over small provocations, arguments erupting over nothing, a misplaced tool or an imagined slight, or simply the way someone breathes. These mood swings are frightening in their unpredictability. A man who was cheerful in the morning, or what they're calling morning, might be near tears by afternoon, or what they're calling afternoon, or might be sitting and staring at the wall as if he's forgotten how to be human. Heemskerk, as captain, bears the burden of maintaining morale and discipline, and it's a weight that shows on him. His face, which began the voyage as the solid, confident face of a man accustomed to command, has become drawn and haggard. He moves through the house, checking on men, speaking to them individually, trying to gauge their mental states, trying to catch signs of breakdown before they become critical. Because a man who breaks down completely in this environment becomes a liability to everyone. He can't be left alone. He can't be trusted to stand watch. He consumes resources, food and warmth and attention without contributing to the collective survival. And yet, abandoning him is unthinkable. So, Heemskerk must be part commander, part nurse, part priest, tending to bodies and souls with equal attention. Willem Barentsz, despite his declining physical health, serves a crucial role as the spiritual and intellectual anchor of the group. He's older than most of them, more educated, more widely traveled. When men come to him with questions or fears, he responds with patience and what seems like wisdom, though privately he's as terrified as anyone. He talks about previous expeditions, about other men who endured hardship and survived. He discusses navigation and geography and the movement of stars, intellectual topics that remind the men they're part of a larger human project of exploration and discovery. He's essentially conducting ongoing therapy sessions without knowing that's what they are providing cognitive structure to help men organize their experiences into something meaningful rather than just random suffering. But even Barentsz has his breaking points. There are days when the pain in his joint scurvy is wreaking havoc on his body, though he doesn't fully understand why it's so severe he can barely move. Days when he stares at the fire and doesn't speak, lost in his own darkness. On those days, others must rally around him, must become the strong ones, must provide the reassurance and hope that he usually provides them. It's a reminder that leadership in extreme conditions is not a fixed role, but a rotating responsibility that everyone must take their turn holding the group together. The absence of sun does something to the body's internal clock that the men can feel, but not name. They become tired at odd times, wide awake when they should be sleeping, sluggish when they need to be alert. Their appetites become erratic. Some men can barely force down their rations, others are constantly hungry, stomach growling, even after eating their allotted portion. Sleep patterns fracture completely, and this fragmentation compounds the psychological stress because the human brain needs sleep to process emotions and consolidate memories, and without regular restorative sleep, the mind begins to malfunction. Hallucinations become common, though the men don't discuss them openly, because admitting to hallucinations feels like admitting to madness, and madness in this place is a death sentence. De Vere sees his wife standing by the fire one night, as real as any living person, and he starts to speak to her before realizing she can't possibly be there. Another man insists he hears music, beautiful music coming from outside, and he wants to open the door to find its source. And others must physically restrain him, because opening the door in pursuit of phantom music would mean certain death. These hallucinations are not constant, but they're frequent enough that the men learn to check with each other before trusting their own perceptions. Did you see that? Did you hear that? The question is asked not with mockery, but with genuine concern, because everyone understands that their minds are under assault. The darkness also amplifies sound in strange ways. Or perhaps it's just that without visual stimulation, the men become hyper-aware of every noise. The wind becomes a symphony of variations, each gust and moan distinct and meaningful. The fire talks to itself in pops and hisses. The house creaks in complex patterns that some men swear have meaning, as if the structure is trying to communicate. Footsteps on the sleeping platform sound thunderous. Breathing becomes loud. The scrape of a spoon against a tin plate echoes like a bell. In this auditory landscape, silence becomes precious and also terrifying. When a man goes completely quiet, when he stops making the small noises of existence, breathing and shifting and clearing his throat, it draws attention. Others will look over, checking to make sure he's still alive, still conscious, still participating in the shared project of survival. Because silence can mean a man has slipped too far into his own darkness, has retreated to a place where the others can't reach him. To combat the psychological weight of darkness, the men have developed strategies, some conscious and some instinctive. They talk more than necessary, filling the air with words, even when there's nothing important to say. They tell jokes, often terrible jokes. They've all heard multiple times, but they laugh anyway, because laughter is a defense against despair. They sing sometimes work songs and sea shanties from their sailing days, and the singing creates a sense of togetherness. 17 voices raised in unison against the dark. They also create light whenever possible. Any excuse to light an extra candle or burn a little more whale oil, because light, even a tiny flickering flame, pushes back the darkness just enough to remind them that darkness can be pushed back. They've become almost obsessive about maintaining the lamp that burns constantly near the hearth, treating it like a sacred flame that must never be allowed to go out, as if its extinction would mean their own. Physical touch becomes important in ways that would be uncomfortable in normal society, but are essential here. Men touch each other frequently, a hand on a shoulder, a pat on the back, helping someone adjust their blanket, checking another's hands for frostbite. This touch is not intimate in a sexual sense. It's something more fundamental, a confirmation that other warm living humans exist in this cold, dead place. It's communication that transcends words, a language of reassurance and solidarity that doesn't require linguistic processing. They create structure because structure helps the mind cope with chaos. The watch schedule the meal times the evening reading. These aren't just practical arrangements, they're psychological scaffolding. They divide the formless darkness into chunks that have names and purposes. Morning watch, afternoon meal, evening prayers, night watch. The labels are arbitrary, but the structure they create is vital. It gives the men a framework for organizing their experience, for understanding where they are in the flow of time, even when all external markers of time have disappeared. And they remember. They talk about home, constantly describing Amsterdam's streets and buildings with such detail you'd think they were reading from a guidebook. They describe meals they've eaten, taverns, they've visited, women they've known. They tell stories about their families, their children, their parents, their friends. These stories serve multiple purposes. They keep the memories alive and clear. They remind the men that another world exists beyond this frozen hell, that they came from somewhere warm and might return there. And they provide entertainment, because a well-told memory can be as engaging as any fiction. But memory is also painful. Every remembered warmth is a contrast to the present cold. Every remembered meal highlights current hunger. Every remembered embrace underscores current loneliness. So the men must walk a careful line, remembering enough to stay connected to their humanity, but not so much that they become paralyzed by homesickness and despair. There are nights when individual men break down completely, sobbing uncontrollably, muttering about giving up, about wanting it to end. On these nights, others gather around, not judging, not criticizing, just being present. Sometimes they hold the broken man until the storm passes. Sometimes they talk to him quietly, reminding him why they must endure what they're surviving for. Sometimes they just sit with him in silence, their presence enough to communicate that he's not alone, that they're all struggling, that his pain is understood and shared. These moments of breakdown are followed by periods of almost manic energy, as if the emotional release opens up reserves of strength that were previously locked away. The men throw themselves into tasks with renewed vigor, cleaning things that don't need cleaning, organizing supplies that are already organized, anything to burn off the excess energy and avoid sliding back into despair. Barentsz observes all of this, and in his more lucid moments marvels at the human mind's capacity to adapt to the utterly abnormal. That men can live in conditions that should destroy them mentally within days, and yet after months they're still functional, still capable of rational thought and coordinated action. It's a testament to something, though he's not sure what. The flexibility of human psychology, the power of social bonds, or simply the stubborn refusal of consciousness to surrender to darkness. As January progresses and they begin to see brief periods of twilight, hope creeps back into the house. The sky lightens for an hour or two around midday, not true daylight, but a deep blue glow that hints at the sun's existence somewhere below the horizon. This twilight becomes the most anticipated part of each day. Men position themselves where they can see out the small gaps in the walls, just to witness that subtle change in the quality of darkness, to see black become blue, to confirm that the world still has colors besides grey and white and the orange of the fire. And then on January 24th, the sun returns. Just a sliver, just the upper edge of the disk peeking over the horizon for a few minutes before sinking back down. But those few minutes are transformative. The men crowd at the door, stepping outside into the killing cold, just to see it, to feel that faint warmth on their faces, to weep with relief and joy and renewed hope. Because the sun's return is not just astronomical, it's psychological. It's proof that their ordeal has a terminus, that winter will end, that light exists, and will return fully in time. From that day forward, though, months of hardship still lie ahead. The psychological burden lightens incrementally. The darkness becomes less oppressive because they know it's temporary now. They've survived the worst. They've made it through the polar night and come out the other side, still sane, still human, still together. And if they can survive that, they tell each other they can survive anything. To understand what the men of Het Behouden Huis endured, we must see them as products of their time. It was 1596, on the edge of the Dutch Golden Age, an era of wealth ambition, faith and limited knowledge. These were not modern explorers, but merchants and sailors driven by profit as much as curiosity, funded by Amsterdam's trading class in hopes of breaking Iberian control of Asian trade. Their belief in an ice-free polar sea, endorsed by respected geographers, was flawed, but logical by 16th century standards. Barentsz himself was experienced aware of the dangers, yet compelled to try again. Their ship was a merchant vessel built for commerce, not ice. Reaching the Arctic was remarkable. Surviving it was not what it was designed to do. Calvinist faith shaped their response to suffering, offering both comfort and dread. Their technology and medicine were advanced for the era, yet deeply incomplete. They knew what helped Lemon's fresh meat routine, but not why. Survival came through adaptation, hunting foxes and bears, improvising shelter and clothing, learning through pain. Culturally, they came from one of Europe's most ordered cities into a world utterly indifferent to human needs. That shock transformed them. Leadership remained consultative rather than authoritarian, fostering cohesion. De Vere's journal reflected a Dutch belief that knowledge itself justified suffering. When 12 men returned, they were changed and celebrated. Their story became part of Dutch identity, proof that ordinary people armed with cooperation, faith, and stubborn resolve could endure the unendurable. Not through heroics, but through patience, shared effort, and the belief that winter would not last forever. At the heart of Het Behouden Huis lies a deeper mystery, not how they survived, but why they didn't break. 17 men, later 12, endured 10 months of isolation under conditions that should have destroyed them psychologically. Modern theory predicts collapse, conflict, scapegoating, fragmentation. Yet the records show tension, not disintegration, no mutiny, no murders, no complete breakdowns. How did they hold together? The answer, insofar as we can reconstruct it, lies in a set of social and psychological mechanisms that these men employed, some consciously and some not, that amount to a kind of collective therapy, a winter survival skill for the mind, as sophisticated as any physical technique for staying warm. First, there was the maintenance of ritual. The human mind craves structure, and in an environment where all external structure has vanished, where day and night are meaningless, and the calendar becomes abstract, creating artificial structure is crucial. The men maintained their schedule with almost religious devotion. Watches were kept, meals were served at designated times, evening prayers were never skipped. These rituals served multiple functions simultaneously. They provided temporal landmarks, ways of organizing experience. They created predictability in an unpredictable world. And they enforced the continuation of social norms, reminding everyone that they were still civilized humans, not animals struggling for survival. Second, they maintained individual identity within the collective. Each man had his designated sleeping space, however small. Each had his own cup, his own set of personal items. These possessions were sacred, never taken or borrowed without permission. This might seem trivial, but maintaining a sense of individual identity when you're packed 17 bodies into a space the size of a modern living room is essential for mental health. The worst prison is not physical confinement, but the loss of self. And by respecting each other's boundaries and possessions, the men preserved each other's sense of being distinct individuals, rather than just parts of a desperate collective. Third, they practiced what we might now call emotional regulation through group support. When a man was struggling, others noticed and intervened, not with judgment or criticism, but with presence and distraction. They'd engage him in conversation, involve him in a task, sit with him quietly. There was an implicit understanding that emotional breakdown was not weakness, but a normal response to abnormal conditions, and that preventing complete collapse was everyone's responsibility. They were performing without training or theoretical understanding, a kind of peer counseling that mental health professionals would later formalize into treatment protocols. Fourth, they maintained hope through incremental goals. The impossible goal was survive until spring and get home. That goal was too distant, too abstract, too laden with uncertainty. So they broke it down. Survive until tomorrow. Survive until the next meal. Survive until the next watch change. Make it through this week. Make it to the next celebration day. By focusing on immediate achievable goals, they avoided the paralysis that comes from contemplating the full magnitude of their predicament. Each small success, each day survived, became evidence that survival was possible, building a foundation of confidence that sustained them through the next challenge. Fifth, they practiced what anthropologists call communitas, a state of social bonding that emerges in liminal situations, times and spaces where normal social structures are suspended. In het behouden huis, the usual hierarchies of Dutch society, merchant versus sailor versus laborer, became less relevant than the more fundamental distinction between those who contributed to collective survival and those who didn't. This equalizing effect paradoxically strengthened social bonds because it meant that leadership and respect could be earned by anyone through their actions, not just assumed by those with the highest rank. Anthropologists note that isolated groups under extreme stress often develop expedition behavior, a shared microculture of norms, in-jokes, and private language. The men of het behouden huis did the same, creating nicknames, routines, and small traditions around sleep watches and prayers. This shared world, understood only by them, fostered a strong sense of belonging and cohesion. There is a darker side to this story. 5 men died officially from scurvy, exhaustion, and exposure, but the mental toll cannot be ignored. In extreme survival, psychological surrender often comes before physical death. The body endures only while the mind remains engaged. the trauma didn't end with rescue. Though unnamed in 1597, post-traumatic stress followed the survivors home. Some never went to sea again. Others returned, changed, carrying an inner darkness. De Vere spent much of his life revising his journal, as if retelling the story might help him make sense of what the Arctic had done to them. One aspect of the mystery that's particularly intriguing is the role of the natural environment itself in their psychological survival. The Arctic at this latitude is beautiful in ways that are hard to describe, with light effects and ice formations and atmospheric phenomena that are utterly alien to anyone from temperate climates. When the sun did return, when the polar twilight began to paint the ice in shades of blue and purple and pink, the men must have found this beauty sustaining a reminder that the universe contains more than just cold and darkness. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, which are frequently visible at these latitudes, would have been unlike anything they'd ever seen. Curtains of green and red and purple light dancing across the sky. There's no mention of the aurora in De Vere's journal, which is strange unless he considered it unremarkable or was too exhausted to document everything. But they must have seen it, must have stepped outside into the bitter cold to watch the lights perform, and perhaps in those moments of beauty they found a kind of transcendence, a break from suffering into wonder. The mystery deepens when we consider the artifacts that were recovered when Het Behouden Huis was discovered in 1871, nearly 3 centuries later. Among the items found were carved chess pieces, children's toys, things that served no practical survival function. Why would men on the edge of death be carving chess pieces or making toys? The answer must be that these activities were essential in a different way, not for physical survival, but for psychological survival. Creating something exercising skill and craft, maintaining the ability to engage in play even in the least playful environment imaginable, was a way of asserting their humanity, of proving to themselves that they were more than just bodies trying to stay warm. They were still men, still capable of thought and creativity, and the human activities that have no survival value except that they make survival worth pursuing. There's a philosophical dimension to all of this that's worth pondering as you drift towards sleep. What does the story of Het Behouden Huis tell us about human nature? One interpretation is dark, that we're fundamentally fragile creatures capable of being broken by our environment, surviving only through luck and desperate improvisation. But another interpretation is more hopeful, that we're fundamentally resilient, capable of adapting to conditions that seem unsurvivable, and that our greatest strength is not individual toughness, but our capacity for cooperation, for caring about each other, even when caring requires sacrifice. The men in Het Behouden Huis were not exceptional. They were ordinary, and that's what makes their story so powerful. If ordinary men can endure what they endured, what does that say about human potential? About our capacity to survive, not just physical challenges, but psychological and spiritual ones. About the power of small kindnesses, shared warmth and collective purpose to sustain us through the darkest winters of our lives. These are questions without definitive answers, mysteries that each generation must contemplate anew. But as you lie in your warm bed, in your lit room, in your safe place, perhaps there's comfort in knowing that humans just like you, with no special training or superhuman qualities, found ways to survive and even maintain their dignity and humanity in conditions that should have destroyed them. They show us that winter survival skills are not just about fire and shelter and food. They're about community, about meaning, about refusing to surrender to the cold, whether that cold is physical or spiritual. As the months dragged on in Het Behouden Huis, the men came to a profound realization, one that indigenous Arctic peoples have known for thousands of years. The greatest defense against extreme cold isn't a thicker coat or a hotter fire. It's other human bodies. True warmth is something we create together. Their sleeping platform raised along the walls became a quiet map of sacrifice and care. Positions weren't chosen by chance. They were negotiated with unspoken precision, balancing strength, need, and fairness. At the edges closest to the biting frost of the outer walls slept the youngest and strongest. They woke each morning with ice in their beards, fingers numb, toes slow to thaw. No one volunteered for these spots, yet no one complained. They accepted the hardship, knowing it shielded the older and weaker from places where cold could kill. Closer to the center lay the middle ranks men, sturdy enough to endure, but grateful for the heat radiating from those around them. And at the very heart, wrapped in the warmest cocoon of bodies and fire glow, slept Willem Barentsz. It wasn't privilege that placed him there, but necessity. Scurvy ravaged him hardest, bleeding gums, loosening teeth, swollen joints, old wounds that refused to heal. He needed every degree of warmth to keep fighting. The men rotated around him, sharing the burden of his restless pain, his moans in the night, checking his breath without being asked. No words were needed. This was their unspoken pact. We keep each other alive. That's the only rule that matters. At first, they clung to privacy, each wrapped in his own blanket. But the cold demanded more. Gradually, they drew closer, then closer still, until they lay pressed together like spoons, front to back limbs, entwined for warmth and quiet comfort. Modesty, once sacred in Amsterdam, became a forgotten luxury. An arm across a chest, a head on a shoulder, these were no longer intimate. They were survival. They learned to ignore the sounds of the body, snoring, grinding teeth, the inevitable flatulence of meager rations. No one spoke of them. It was a silent kindness, preserving dignity where privacy was impossible. 17 bodies, then 16, then 15, generated a fragile pocket of heat, raising the platform just above freezing while the floor stayed locked in ice. But closeness brought dampness breath, and sweat condensed on walls and clothing, turning wool cold and clammy. They hung garments by the fire when they could manage moisture like a precious resource. There were no secrets in that small space. Tears in the night were heard. Fears muttered in sleep were known. Yet instead of breeding resentment, this raw transparency deepened understanding. A man rose to relieve himself. Others shifted without waking. A nightmare gripped someone. A gentle hand stirred him back. Small conflicts arose over blanket space, loud snoring, uneven effort. But leaders like Heemskerk mediated quietly. Division would have been fatal. Unity was everything. Even the watch system was an act of shared trust. 2 men always awake guarding the fire and the sleepers so the others could truly rest. On rare good days, a successful hunt, a remembered holiday, they shared tiny luxuries. A sliver of dried fruit, a sip of watered wine divided with solemn equality. These moments weren't about the taste. They were proof. We are still human. We are still together. As spring finally approached and sunlight returned, the desperate press of bodies eased just slightly. A few inches of space reappeared, a quiet vote of hope that they might live to sleep alone again. But something fundamental had changed. They had learned in the harshest way that we are not meant to survive alone. The myth of the solitary hero crumbles in true cold. The truth is, messier, warmer, more beautiful we endure by sharing our heat, our strength, our hope. This is the deepest winter survival skill they discovered, and perhaps the most vital one of all. When your own dark season comes, whether of cold grief or isolation, remember het behouden huis. Remember 17 men pressed close on a wooden platform, holding each other through the endless night. Asking for help is not weakness. Offering warmth is not sacrifice, it's wisdom. Because in the end, we keep each other alive, and together we can survive anything. The wind outside has shifted slightly, a change so subtle that only someone who's lived with this sound for months would notice. It's no longer the howling assault of earlier in the winter, but something softer, more like a constant sigh, as if the Arctic itself is growing tired of its own fury. Inside het behouden huis, the fire has been built up carefully for the night, the flames dancing in shades of orange and gold, casting shifting shadows on the frost-covered walls that look like the walls are breathing. 15 men, because 2 have already passed into whatever awaits beyond this cold lie on the sleeping platform in their now familiar configurations. Their breathing has synchronized without any conscious effort, rising and falling together, creating a rhythm that is almost musical, a quiet symphony of survival. The men on watch, perhaps it's De Vere, and one of the younger sailors tonight, sit wrapped in blankets by the fire, watching the flames and listening to the wind and the sleeping men and the house itself as it creaks and settles. Look at them for a moment, these survivors. Their faces are gaunt, hollowed by months of insufficient food and constant stress. Their skin has taken on a greyness that has nothing to do with the firelight, and everything to do with bodies pushed beyond normal limits. Their beards are matted and crusted with ice. Their hands are wrapped in crude mittens that they remove reluctantly even near the fire because the cold bites so quickly at exposed flesh. But look also at what remains. The determination in eyes that have seen too much darkness but refuse to close permanently. The way hands reach out automatically to adjust a companion's blanket, to check that someone is still breathing, to offer comfort without words. The way they've maintained their humanity despite everything. They still say their prayers. They still share their rations equally. They still help each other through the darkness. Willem Barentsz sleeps fitfully in his protected spot at the center of the platform. His breathing is labored, each inhalation a small struggle. The men nearest him have grown accustomed to this sound, monitoring it unconsciously, even in their own sleep, ready to respond if the pattern changes in a way that suggests crisis. They know, though no one says it aloud, that Barentsz is unlikely to see Amsterdam again. But they care for him anyway, because that's what you do. You care for each other until you can't anymore, and then you keep caring, because the alternative is to become something less than human. The fire pops, and a small ember arcs out onto the dirt floor where it glows briefly before dying. Neither of the watching men moves to retrieve it, because it poses no danger, and they've learned to conserve their energy for things that matter. Outside, something makes a sound, perhaps an ice crack or a piece of driftwood settling, and both watchers tense hands moving toward the weapons that are always within reach. But the sound doesn't repeat, and they relax again, returning to their vigil. Time passes. The hourglass runs out, and one of the watchers flips it, marking another few hours survived. How many hours has it been now? How many times have they flipped that glass, watched the sand run from one chamber to the other, measuring out their imprisonment in grains? Thousands, surely. Tens of thousands. Each tiny grain a moment of their lives spent in this place, a moment they'll never get back, a moment that feels both precious and wasted. But they're still here. That's the miracle that's easy to lose sight of in the day-to-day struggle. They're still here, still breathing, still thinking, still dreaming of home and spring, and a future that grows more plausible with each passing day as the sun climbs higher in the sky and the ice begins to show the first faint signs of softening. Outside the house, beyond the walls that have sheltered them through the darkest months, Novaya Zemlya lies frozen and indifferent. The sea is locked in ice that extends to the horizon, and beyond, an unbroken plain of white that seems to go on forever. The mountains in the distance are sharp black silhouettes against a sky that's deep blue now, in the middle of the day, no longer the absolute black of December and January. Stars wheel overhead in patterns that Barentsz could name constellations that have guided sailors since humans first ventured onto the sea, eternal and unchanging, while human lives flicker and fade like candle flames. And somewhere impossibly far away across frozen seas and unfriendly lands, Amsterdam waits. Canals reflecting lamplight. Merchants arguing over prices in the crowded markets. Ships coming and going with the tides. Women walking with baskets of bread. Children playing in narrow streets. Church bells marking the hours. Life continuing in its comfortable rhythms. People pursuing their ordinary concerns, unaware that 17 of their countrymen, or what remains of 17, are struggling to survive at the top of the world. Do the families know by now? Have they been told that the ships never returned, that their husbands and sons and brothers are presumed lost? Are their widows already remarrying children? Being told their fathers died as heroes? Or is there still hope, still the daily checking of the harbour for sails that never appear? Both scenarios are heartbreaking in their own ways. But these thoughts are for the waking mind, and yours is beginning to drift, beginning to let go of the need to follow every detail, every name, every date. That's as it should be. Because the story of Het Behouden Huis is not really about dates and names and technical details of survival. It's about something deeper and more fundamental. It's about the fact that humans can endure almost anything if they have a reason, that we're stronger together than apart, that small acts of kindness multiplied over time can make the difference between life and death, that memory and hope are as essential to survival as food and fire, that the worst winters eventually end even when they seem eternal. That spring always comes even to the Arctic, even to the frozen places, even when you've stopped believing it's possible. The men sleeping on that platform in 1597 couldn't know that their story would be told 4 centuries later, couldn't know that their struggle would become legend, couldn't know that the house they built would be found nearly intact almost 300 years after they abandoned it. A time capsule of human courage and desperation. They were just trying to survive one more day, one more night, one more turn of the hourglass. But in doing so, they proved something important. They proved that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary endurance. That winter survival skills are not just about fire and shelter, but about community and purpose, and the stubborn refusal to give up. That the coldest place on Earth is not the Arctic, but a human heart without hope, and that as long as hope remains, as long as we care for each other, as long as we maintain our humanity in the face of inhumanity, we can survive anything. So let yourself slip away now into your own warm darkness, into sleep that is safe and comfortable, and nothing like what those men experienced. Let the images fade. The frozen house, the exhausted faces, the endless wind. Let them become dream, become memory, become story. You've walked with them through their long night, and now you can rest, knowing that they made it. Most of them made it through the winter and the spring, and the desperate journey home. The fire burns low in Het Behoudenhuis. The watchers tend it carefully. The sleeping men breathe their synchronized breath. And far away beyond time and distance, you drift into sleep, into your own darkness that is gentle and kind, into dreams that may carry echoes of ice and wind, and the quiet courage of ordinary men facing extraordinary cold. The wind outside your window, wherever you are, whatever year it is just wind. Not the Arctic wind, not the wind that wants to kill. Just wind moving air, the breath of a planet that spins through space, carrying all of us, the living and the dead, the brave and the frightened, the remembered and the forgotten. Sleep now. The long night is over. Spring is coming. The men of Het Behoudenhuis survived their winter, and you will survive yours. Whatever cold you face, whatever darkness presses in, remember them. Remember that humans have faced worse and endured. Remember that you're not alone, even when you feel alone. Remember that winter survival skills are something we all need, and something we can all learn, and something we pass down through stories like this one, from one generation to the next, from the frozen past to the uncertain future, carrying light through darkness, warmth through cold hope, through despair. The hourglass runs out. The watcher flips it. The sand begins to fall again. Time continues. Life continues. And somewhere in some museum in Amsterdam, artifacts from Het Behoudenhuis sit in climate-controlled display cases, wood and metal and fabric, that survived centuries because they were frozen in place, preserved by the same cold that nearly killed the men who left them behind. They tell their silent story to visitors who pass by, most not stopping long enough to truly see, to truly understand what these simple objects represent. A wooden cup, a shoe, a book with pages still readable. Evidence that humans were here, suffered here, endured here, and eventually went home to tell the tale. Sleep well, traveller. You've earned your rest. The watch will be kept, the fire will be tended, and morning in all its warmth and light will come again. The fire has burned down to embers now in our imagination, in our memory of that winter so long ago. The men of Het Behoudenhuis slept on or woke to tend the flames, or simply lay in the darkness and thought their private thoughts, cycling through the same routines that had kept them alive for months, for what must have felt like lifetimes. What they couldn't know lying there in early 1597 was how the story would end. They didn't know that in June, when the ice finally loosened enough to attempt an escape, they would load 2 small open boats with what supplies remained and begin an incredible journey across 1,500 miles of Arctic Sea. They didn't know that Willem Barentsz, their navigator and spiritual guide, would die within the first week of that journey, his body finally surrendering to the accumulated damage of scurvy and cold and exhaustion, and that they would commit him to the sea that had been his life's work. They didn't know that 12 of them would make it somehow, against all reasonable odds, rowing and sailing their tiny boats through ice floes and storms until they reached the Kola Peninsula, where they would encounter Russian fishermen who would stare in amazement at these skeletal wraiths who'd appeared from the frozen north. They didn't know they would eventually reach Amsterdam in November 1597, a full 18 months after they'd left, and that they would be greeted as heroes and also as ghosts. Men presumed dead, suddenly walking through familiar streets, shocking their families and friends with their return. They didn't know that Gerrit de Veer's journal would become a bestseller, translated across Europe, read by generations of explorers and adventurers and ordinary people who wanted to understand what humans are capable of when tested to their limits. They didn't know that their story would influence Arctic exploration for centuries to come, that every subsequent expedition would study their experiences, learning from their mistakes and their innovations. And they certainly didn't know that in 1871, a Norwegian captain named Elling Carlsen would stumble upon their abandoned house, still standing after nearly 3 centuries, its contents preserved by the permafrost like a time capsule. That teams of archaeologists would carefully excavate the site, finding books and tools and clothing, and even playing cards artifacts that now reside in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, tangible connections to that terrible winter. They didn't know that their suffering would be remembered, studied, honored. But perhaps on some level they hoped it would be. Perhaps that's part of why de Veer kept writing in his journal, even when his fingers were too cold to hold the pen properly, even when nothing new seemed to happen, even when he was exhausted beyond measure. He was bearing witness. He was ensuring that if they died, at least someone would know they'd been there, would know what they'd attempted, would know how hard they'd tried. And now, more than 400 years later, we do know. We know their names and their story. We know about the house they built and the winter they endured, and the courage they displayed not through grand gestures, but through countless small acts of perseverance and mutual care. Their story has become part of our shared human heritage, a reminder of what we can survive, what we can accomplish, how we can maintain our humanity even when everything conspires to strip it away. As you drift fully into sleep, now carrying with you these images of cold and darkness and the small persistent flame of human courage, perhaps you'll dream of ice and wind. Perhaps you'll dream of the northern lights dancing over frozen seas. Perhaps you'll dream of 17 men huddled together for warmth, sharing their last resources, refusing to surrender. Or perhaps you'll simply sleep deeply and peacefully in your warm bed, in your safe place, grateful for the mundane miracles of central heating and electric lights, and the certain knowledge that morning will come with its sun. Either way, you've taken a journey tonight back through time into a winter that tested the limits of human endurance and proved that those limits are further than we imagine, that the human spirit, when joined with other human spirits in common purpose, can survive almost anything. The men of Het Behouden Huis, those who survived and those who didn't, have been resting for centuries now. Their struggles are long over. Their winter has ended. But their story continues, passed down through generations, adapted into books and films, and now into this whispered history, designed to ease you into sleep, a bedtime story for adults who understand that the world is both harsher and more beautiful than children. Know that history is written not just by kings and generals, but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply because they must. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the frozen past. Thank you for listening to their story, for honoring their memory by learning what they endured. Before you drift away completely, if you found value in tonight's journey, I hope you'll consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps others find these stories, helps keep history alive in whatever small way we can. And perhaps, before sleep claims, you entirely take a moment to be grateful for your own warmth, your own safety, your own ability to survive winters, whether literal or metaphorical, that come your way. Think of the winter survival skills we all need, not just the physical ones, but the emotional and social ones. The ability to ask for help and offer it, to maintain hope when hope seems foolish, to care for others, even when you're struggling yourself. The story of Willem Barentsz and his crew is not just history to fall asleep to. It's a reminder that humans have always faced winters, have always struggled, have always found ways to endure. Our winters may be different now. They may be winters of loneliness or grief or fear rather than literal cold. But the skills those men learned, the importance of community and routine and small kindnesses and refusing to surrender, those translate across time and circumstance. So sleep now with the knowledge that whatever winter you're facing, you're part of a long tradition of human endurance. You come from people who survived ice ages and plagues and famines and wars. You carry in your DNA the legacy of countless ancestors who faced terrible odds and persisted anyway. Their courage is your courage. Their resilience is your resilience. Their story is in some essential way your story too. The wind outside Het Behouden has finally quieted. The watch is kept. The fire glows. And across 4 centuries, across impossible distance, their story reaches you here. Now a whisper from the frozen past into your warm present, carrying a message as simple as it is profound. Humans endure. Winter ends, spring comes. Hold on. Take care of each other. Survive another day. That's enough. That's everything. Good night, traveler. Sleep well, dream gently, and wake tomorrow to your own spring, whatever form it takes, carrying with you the quiet knowledge that you are stronger than you know, more resilient than you imagine, more connected to the great human story of survival and hope than you might have believed. The story of Het Behouden is over, but your story continues. Rest now. Tomorrow awaits, and whatever winter you face, you'll face it knowing that others have faced worse and survived that winter. Survival skills are learned through hardship, but remembered with gratitude, and that as long as we care for each other, as long as we maintain our humanity, as long as we refuse to let the cold wind spring, will come again. Sleep peacefully. The long Arctic night has ended. Dawn is breaking over ice that's beginning finally to melt. And somewhere, somehow, life continues warmer and brighter and more precious for having been so close to ending. This is Peter Miller, grateful for your company on this journey through history, through cold, through darkness, into the light of understanding that connects us across time. May your sleep be warm and your dreams be gentle. Until we meet again, take care of yourself and those you love. Good night.